Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with the Boston Public Library. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, looking at the Civil War era, particularly the experience of enslaved people and soldiers. Tonight, we'll be experiencing history, war, and racial conflict in voices and through poetry. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book Load In 9 Times by Frank X. Walker. Professor Walker will soon join us on screen, and for 40 minutes, he'll discuss his book, show historical images, and read his poetry. After that, Kristen Motti of the Boston Public Library and I would be happy to pose your questions to our guest author and poet. You can enter those anytime into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on the lower right-hand side. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be shared with all registered attendees, around 200 of you. In the hours ahead, it will be coming your way. Please feel free to share that link, to forward the link, passing on what we all will have learned tonight about the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Black history. And of course, all about historical poetry, which is a genre that we have really come to like, all of us behind the scenes here. Of course, the real education and awareness comes from reading tonight's featured work. Copies of the hardcover, Load In 9 Times, can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Walker's historical poetry has gotten glowing reviews. Publishers Weekly said he, quote, draws on the emotional and psychological dimensions of poetry to transform slavery from historical fact to lived experience. As you order the book from Porter Square Books, input the code AMINS24, and it will come signed by the author on a book plate. These special copies, signed copies, can be sent to you, your friends, or family anywhere in the United States. Now for some background on Professor Walker. Over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, thank you for joining us. I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian at the Central Library of the BPL. We're grateful to be in partnership with our Boston neighbors, American Ancestors, for tonight's program. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our feature speaker, poet Frank X. Walker. Professor Frank X. Walker is the author of 13 poetry collections. He was named the 2013 Kentucky Poet Laureate and is co-founder of the Appalachian Poets. Walker serves as professor of English and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. He resides in Lexington, Kentucky. Before we meet Professor Walker, Margaret has an advisory to share. Margaret, back over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Before we start in, on behalf of all of us behind the scenes, a note of caution about the contents of tonight's event. As you can imagine, with the topic of this book, the experience of enslaved peoples, and also its title, Load In 9 Times, which is a military term for how to fire, how to load and to fire a musket. Tonight's discussion, given these things, will include graphic details of war and enslavement, illustrating the horrors of combat and racism. These are not happy poems. They are works of history, a presentation of truth and facts told through individual voices and verse. That said, there is much history here, and we are eager to get right into this and to hear some poetry, some historical poetry. So welcome to you, Professor Walker. We are so glad you're here, and over to you, as Kristen said, in Lexington, Kentucky. It's a thrill for us to have you here.
It's a thrill for me to be here, and thank to all of those out there in the virtual world. Wish I could see you. It really adds the intimacy that poetry requires when you can actually have a connection with the audience. I'm going to pretend like you're in the room with me all the way here in Lexington, and we'll step right into this space. that we have labeled Load in 9 times. So if Maggie can get us started. In this first image that you're looking at, what you're seeing are several things that are important to this larger narrative. These individuals are mostly former enslaved men, now in uniform, now part of the Union Army. Behind them on the steps are children. And most people don't think about children when they think about the Civil War. But one of the things that about this particular narrative is that much of it is set at Camp Nelson in Nicholasville, Kentucky. And Camp Nelson was one of the largest refugee camps in the United States during the Civil War. And so many of these poems don't just focus on the soldiers, but they encapsulate the lives of the wives, the children, individuals who taught the children in these spaces. You get a full family experience. So instead of this being a narrative about soldiers in the Civil War, it's really about Black families, and it's set during the Civil War, before, during, and after this particular war. And the thing about these images that I'm really extra proud of is that we were able to find images to support or challenge what I think is a dominant narrative and idea about Kentucky and Civil War and its status as a neutral space. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a close-up of the 107th U.S. Colored Infantry. And even though these gentlemen were stationed at Fort Woodbury when they took this photo, they were organized in Louisville, Kentucky. And the idea that because of Kentucky's neutrality and because of what people believed about Kentucky and the enslavement, particularly this idea that Kentucky may have been a great place to be enslaved because there's an idea that there were no plantations and very few enslaved people. None of those things are true, but it kind of fed this idea that Kentucky's contribution to the war was almost the exact opposite of what it was. If you go on to the next slide, you will see a close-up of some of the faces of these soldiers. And you can see kind of a broad age range. But the thing that's consistent is their facial expression, their commitment. You know, when I see these faces up close, I imagine that, you know, some of these men, maybe a month or two before this, were enslaved. And now not only are they free, that their freedom came with the freedom of their wives and their children. So they're fighting for their entire family. And the idea of freedom and fighting for freedom really means something. So I'm always, you know, a little giddy when I see these stoic expressions, and I'm trying to understand what they may have been thinking given what they had experienced. And every one of these individuals comes with their own individual story. All of these poems were fed by authentic archival material, including Civil War photos. If you go to the next photo, this is an actual image of a Kentucky soldier that came with liner notes on the back of the entry card that opened the idea of a larger story. And each one of these men and their families came with larger stories. This particular card had a note on the back that said that this gentleman, Jesse Hobson, had been chased through the swamps for a week when he escaped enslavement and self-liberated and made his way from Western Kentucky to Paducah, where he signed up and then eventually made it to Louisville, Kentucky before being sent to Camp Nelson, where he was stationed. And all of that came in just 2 sentences. When to me, it's like a short version of a movie of his life. And each one of those details are worth a movie, in my opinion. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that this next photo is a reminder that not all of these soldiers were formerly enslaved men. Some of them were already free. This particular gentleman, Major Charles Singer, had been a a free man and businessman in northern Kentucky before he signed up to participate in the war effort. And even the number of men who did so is often alarming to people because they think about Kentucky's alleged non-participation, but Kentucky's 23,703 African American soldiers who signed up in Kentucky were just short of Louisiana, making them the second largest contributors to the war if you only consider the men who signed up in their state. It's been estimated that almost 5,000 more men left Kentucky and joined the Union Army in other states. So that means that Kentucky contributed the largest number, significantly so, of African American soldiers this effort for people of color's freedom. And so this changes a lot about what people think about Kentucky's role during the Civil War, Kentucky's attitude about enslavement. To have this kind of commitment really speaks volumes, especially when you consider that in one summer, right after they made it no longer a requirement to have your master's consent to join the war effort, over 10,000 men signed up at this particular Camp Nelson in one summer before reaching that total 23,000 plus. So to generate that much effort to join the freedom effort says something about the institution they were trying to relieve themselves of. Go to the next slide. There's for those of you who made it to Washington, D.C., you may have hopefully seen this monument already, but this monument is at 10th and U Street, considered the only monument on the mall in D.C. contributed and created by an African-American sculptor. Ed Hamilton is the artist behind this beautiful monument. And on the front side, you see traditional soldiers. To the right of that image, you see a sailor. And the concave part of this particular monument has the families on the backside. For me, it really sums up even what the book is trying to do by telling the stories of the soldiers without separating them from their family members. The advantage of Camp Nelson being created to accommodate the families and to host a refugee camp meant that these African-American families, the soldiers, the children, the wives, could also go to school, could begin to not only experience freedom immediately in the hands of having a chance to worship, having a chance to learn in this organized fashion, but to have that in the same space, made it even more important, I can imagine. And behind this particular monument, if you go to the next slide, I guess it was the one before that. This is the image of the children that I mentioned. These are from the archives of the University of Kentucky that shows a group of children. And if you look really closely, you can tell that they're not wearing children's clothes. They're wearing what looks like their parents' or grandparents' clothing. You see all the suspenders and the hats and the baggy pants and clothing. And even 3/4 of the way over to the right, there's one particular child that's dressed in a Union uniform, just under the window on the right, which kind of reminds you that, their lives, their existence was not only challenged, but up until this point, when they were in Camp Nelson at the refugee camp, they didn't get a chance to be children. If you go to the next slide, you actually see them in a classroom setting. This is one of the outdoor classrooms that happened at Camp Nelson, maybe just meters away from their fathers who were, training and preparing for battle, that these children they were fighting for were in this amazing space. If you go to the next slide, it goes back to the monument. And this is where it becomes personal for me. This particular monument, the Spirit of Freedom, has a set of steel plates that surround the monument that lists every single soldier who participated as African-American troops, as U.S. colored troops, USCT, infantry or heavy artillery, including my own third great-great-grandfather, Randall Edelen. And I had a chance during the research portion to make it to DC and find his name on the wall. And all the names are listed by their regimental numbers. So if you have this information, which is directly across the street from the National Civil War, African-American Civil War Museum, which was under construction when I was under Reconstruction when I was there. I can't wait to go back to see the finished version of it. But to be able to go over and see Randall Edelen's name on the wall reminds me how this archival material that was made available to me in the pension files and some of the service records that became available to me to do the research allowed me to make some of these poems very personal. So I wasn't just writing about strangers. I wasn't just writing about real people. Some of the individuals that I was able to give voice to were actually my own relatives. And there was a moment in the research where it became harder to move through the process, especially when I found out details I had never heard from even my own family. The next slide reveals a document from Randall Edelen's military files that talks about his health challenges, and where this particular document discusses the fact that he was in Fort Bliss, Texas in June of 1866. It shares the fact that he was lifting a box of blacksmith tools out of the Rio Grande River, which all sounds very exciting, but this is also the very first inkling of what we found out was an injury that he suffered from the rest of his life. This particular incident caused him to be disabled for the rest of his life. And the reason all these documents existed for him, to the tune of 99 pages of affidavits, mostly, where his widow was trying to prove that he had actually been injured during the Civil War. She had to prove that they had been married. She had to prove that they had children. She had proved that he had enlisted in Kentucky, had to prove they had seen doctors. And it took almost 10 years to collect $12 a month pension that he had earned, obviously, by being part of the Union Army. But his wife, who turns out, was able to do this, move through all these documents while also not being literate. If you go to the next slide, there's a close-up of an image that took me about a month to discover. Every time I saw Randall Edelen's wife's name on a document, her name is Mary Edelen, it always looked a little different to me. And I kept thinking, why are these not the same every time? And then I recognized that between her first and last name was something that I hadn't seen before. If you look close, you can see that it says her mark. And between those two words is an actual X or a sideways cross or some kind of mark. And I was able to zoom out and then understand the document enough to know that Mary Edelen was not literate, and somebody else was writing her name down, and all she was asked to do was to identify herself by placing an X or a mark on the page, and this was her mark. And it had to be witnessed by two other individuals who were. And I share this particular example because after almost 10 years of witnessing her signature, towards the end of these 10 years, the witnesses became two of her own children, William and Scott Edelen. And even if you study their signatures, you can see very clearly that William's penmanship is much more beautiful than Scott's. And if you pull back, you have a chance to look at the family tree, you understand that Scott is much younger than William and has had a chance to go to school longer and become literate. And this was a moment for me that was, I would say, not just special, but a little tearful, because I realized that even though my name is Frank X. Walker, and I thought I was the first X in my family, I now had a chance to reconnect with an ancestor who was so many generations away, who had been using X as her own name, who was now reaching across time back to me to have this conversation. So I was even more inspired to really write these poems and try to have them, have a particular life of their own. So I'm going to move to a conversation about the book itself and how it's set up. And if you go to the next slide, you see three images that echo the idea that archival documents and materials are not only important, but useful. In my case, I use each one of these images as opening of each of the three sections for the book. The first section, which features self-emancipation ads on the left, opens up the period of the book that deals with the Black family's challenges and existence before the Civil War in Kentucky specifically. And the one in the middle is a recruitment poster written by none other than Frederick Douglas. And that opens up the section that's specifically in the voice of soldiers who participated in the war. And it deals specifically, and it's the longest part of the book actually, with their experiences coming into the war, what they were allowed to do and able to do, what they had to fight through to earn the freedom that they were so interested in. And then the third section, also archival documents taken straight from old newspapers, is something that most people have never heard about. And it was a whole other set of advertising that was about Black families trying to reconnect with their lost family members. And instead of coming under escaped and escapee ads, these were information wanted. And these were about individuals. In the case of the image on the right, Hannah Barnett in the top is looking for her daughter. And she doesn't know where she is. And it's been years since she's seen her. And if you can imagine what it was like once individuals were free, without any modern technology, people were walking everywhere and placing ads, whether they were literate or not, trying to find their loved ones. And some on the East Coast. And I can imagine that this had to do with the fact that when they were sold further south, they could go as far as New Orleans, no matter where they started from. I'm going to start talking about the poems themselves and how the challenge of translating these archival material into poetry is the challenge that poets have to deal with as historical poets. We have three things to work with, and that's research, memory, and imagination. That infused with empathy allows us to take what might be traditional information that might pass as history and then add some emotion to it to shape it into something that works as a poem. The next slide will show you two documents that talks about a particular era in history and has a whole side history that's connected to Kentucky itself. Most people have heard of My Old Kentucky Home, the song, the state song, especially if they've ever watched the Kentucky Derby, the fastest 2 minutes in sports, every May, first Saturday in May. but they may not know that that song was written in 1853 at the same time as the ad on the right was published. And that song was also written as part of minstrelsy. And when it was sold, it was advertised as sung by Christie's minstrels. And if you know anything about minstrelsy, you know this was not a happy period of time in American history, at least for Black people, because minstrelsy was about the defamation and the caricaturation of Black people by white singers and actors. And for them to appear in blackface with cork makeup and white lips, making fun of Black people or depicting them in a way that was not positive, uh, is a different kind of story where you might want your state song. So for people of color in Kentucky, when we hear the state song, it's not a point of pride for us. In fact, you know, we make a point to not stand up when other people stand up for that song. And it was that energy that led to the first poem I'm going to share with you. And it's called Why I Don't Stand. If you go to the next slide, Maggie, I'll read this for you. And you'll see two different things happening on the page. And you also notice that most of these lyrics have been pulled from the original My Old Kentucky Home lyrics, and or that same ad for Negroes that appeared next to the previous slide you just saw. But now I'll present it as a poem, Why I Don't Stand. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes. 'Tis summer, the darkies are gay. The undersigned wishes to purchase a large lot of Negroes. Well, corn tops ripe for the New Orleans market, and the meadows in the bloom. I will pay $1,200 to $1,250 for number one young men and $850 to $1,000 for number one young women, while the birds make music all the day. In fact, I will pay more for likely Negroes. Weep no more, my lady. Oh, weep no more today. Than any other trader in Kentucky. We sing one song. My office is adjoining the Broadway Hotel, or my old Kentucky home. On Broadway, Lexington, Kentucky. Or my old Kentucky home, far away, where I or my agent can always be found. Now, hopefully, when you hear the poem rendered in that way with a more than a fair amount of emotion, you know, you can hear the kind of challenge for me personally as I try to share the emotional challenge of being in part of the state that has this relationship with a song that is not necessarily about the things people think it is about. And, you know, on one hand, it's exactly why I or people like myself with the knowledge of this information don't stand when they hear the song. But it also points to this history that people have tried to not let us know about. You know, there's this effort nationally to not have the truth told. And part of the mission of this particular book is to tell Kentucky's and the Civil War's truth in a way that shines some light on things that are usually skipped over. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a different kind of poem that's also shaped differently. And I think the challenge for me as a poet and a kind of amateur historian is to serve up history in a way that historians and people who love history feel satisfied, but at the same time, is to provide something for people who love poetry, who come to the page looking for form, who come looking for things about the words of the page that make them feel like they're looking at poetry, no matter what the content is very challenging. And so I've taken great pains in this collection to try to incorporate at least a dozen different forms, particularly new forms, that are very popular in the country today. This next one is an example. This is a poem called Backside of My Old Kentucky Home. And what you're looking at is two columns. And maybe the first thought is that this is two different poems, but in truth, it's three different poems. Because even though the first column on the left can be read together as a separate poem, and the poem on the right in the other column can be read as a separate poem, if you ignore the gap in between, it can be read straight across. And this form is called a contrapuntal. And what makes it a contrapuntal is that these particular voices disagree, and there's an argument happening. And the only time you get the full story is when you read it together. If I read all three versions, what you would hear is one side of the column would be making an argument for the sale of humans, and the other side will be making an argument for the sale of horses, which is Kentucky's story. But if you read it together, it kind of gets lost. You're not really sure if we're talking about one or the other. So I'll read it both ways for the audience so you can hear the difference. Backside of my old Kentucky home. At our estates, we sat on the side porch, stared at humble cabins as young bucks worked and sweated in the fields and sang and danced. We could smell sour mash and brandies and cast iron skillets full of nothing but love. Those were good old days. Breaking them was more Christian than selling them. On horse farms, we sipped mint juleps, looked out over the hills, rode our thoroughbreds, raced each other in the meadows to earn Sundays off to eat the best fried chicken cooked in large kettles and pots. Seasoned genius in every dish. For owners and families, them was more profitable on the auction block. And together, at our estates or horse farms, we sat on the side porch, we sipped mint juleps, stared at humble cabins, looked out over the hills as young bucks rode our thoroughbreds, worked and sweated in the fields, raced each other in the meadows, and sang and danced to earn Sundays off to eat. We could smell the best fried chicken, sour mash, and brandies cooked in large kettles and pots, and cast iron skillets full of seasoned genius, nothing but love in every dish. Those were good old days for owners and families. Breaking them, carefully breeding them was more Christian, was more profitable than selling them on the auction block. And hopefully you can hear the ambivalence, you can hear the challenge of melding the two voices. And even beneath the title, Backside of My Old Kentucky Home, for insiders, people know that if you go to a horse race, most people know about the grandstands, but the people, the regular people, the common people gather on the backside. That's where the jockeys and the hot walkers and the groomsmen, they all gather, not in the grandstands, but back with the horses on the backside. So this is obviously, for me, the perfect title was Backside My Old Kentucky Home. And I hope that makes some sense. And, a couple of more examples of just the form. This next poem, which I won't read, but I'll talk about it, is a poem that can be read maybe 5 different ways. But the subject of the poem is more important to me than reading it to you right now, because hopefully you'll have a chance to read this for yourself at some point in the future. But it's called How Salt Works, and there were 2 horrible events that happened at Camp Nelson. One was called the Saltville Massacre, where a large number of brand new African-American troops went all the way to Saltville, Virginia, and were ambushed and had to retreat immediately. And a great number of African-American men were left wounded, but were murdered the next day when the Confederates found them in blue uniforms. And there's a monument at Camp Nelson to these individuals. And then sometime, maybe if not even a month later at Camp Nelson, a new general arrived and decided that the families did not belong in a camp for soldiers. And he had all the women and children an elderly expelled from the camp on the coldest night of the winter, and over 100 individuals died that weekend. And it raised such an uproar that people wrote letters that were published in the New York Times. And because of that, the backlash from that, the War Department changed their mind and ordered that housing, food, clothing be provided for those members of the families, and that they be allowed back in the camp. And that's when it officially became a refugee camp and part of the Union experience. So this poem tries to tell both of those stories and then weave them together in the middle where the stories cross over. So you're not really sure which of the two horrors are being discussed, because they seem like they're the same thing at times, and they are. But how salt works refers obviously to what happens when you cry, and what happens or what happened at the salt works at the salt field massacre. So I'll let you say that one for yourself and go to the next poem or the next slide. And this is the image again of Mary Edelen's signature or her mark. And for me, I spent a lot of time not just staring at it, but just trying to wonder of what it was like for her to see her own signature and what it felt for her. And I was trying to imagine that at some point she recognized her own name, even though she couldn't read. And if you go to the next slide, I'll read you the poem that came out of this experience. Mary X. Edelen, Civil War widow. And remember, I mentioned earlier, 99 pages of mostly affidavits she had to fill out to try to collect her husband's pension. Them make me scratch out an X in ink with 2 witnesses on affidavits to prove me and Randall was married. I fetched affidavits from every doctor still living that examined my husband's piles and old man's bladder, witnessed his pain, and still doubted his suffering while he rot from the inside. Them even bade me make my mark after David with more witnesses to prove my Randall was dead and gone. They made me X the page with witnesses so many times on so many pension papers that though I cannot read or write a lick, I come to recognize my own name on the page. The fancy M on Mary come to look like a woman keep changing her mind. And the E them like to put on Edelen, a tired old biddy in a bonnet who done set herself down and quit. I first think my mark looked like a tired old cross. But after a while, I come to see a long, sharp knife, like my Randall's old scabbard from the war. And this was important to me because, you know, the more I thought about these stories of these individuals, I didn't want to just present them as victims. You know, I wanted to show the resistance, their resilience, and their will to not just survive, but to fight back when they could, in whatever ways they could. If you go to the next poem, I think this next poem, the next 2 poems actually illustrate this the best. And I'm checking the time real quick, and I think that I'll tell you about this poem, then I'll read the next poem, and then it'll be about almost time for our Q&A. But this is one of the new forms I mentioned earlier that I was committed to. This is called a golden shovel, something created by Terrence Hayes several years ago. And in a golden shovel, you not only get a whole new poem, you get another poem hidden in the edge of the poem. And it doesn't usually appear in a separate color. I just made this one in color for the sake of the slide so you can see. And you may recognize this line from another poem. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. You know, that's from We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. But this poem is about not just Paul Laurence Dunbar, but Paul Laurence Dunbar, but it's about his mother. Most people know that Dunbar had a reputation for having a difficult relationship with his own wife. Uh, and if you do a little bit of research, you found out that his father had a similar relationship uh, with his mother. So he inherited this multi-generational challenge, uh, and particularly, maybe thought he had permission to be involved in domestic abuse. Um, but to me, when I thought about their story, the story that was getting left out was his mother. So this, even the title, Golden Shovel for Matilda Dunbar, allows this poem to celebrate his mother and to talk about her life and her challenges, and at the same time, uh, connect with his father, disguise the fact that he has his own quote unquote famous poem about Civil War soldiers called The Gallant Colored Soldier, which is referenced in the last line of this poem. So you get these literary references as you move through these poems, which I thought was worth bringing to the page. And I'm going to read one more poem for you in the next slide. And this is the title poem called Load in 9 Times. And it's actually in 3 voices. And I've colored them differently here so that it's easy to see how the voices line up. And the voice in red are the actual commands that the sergeant gives that soldiers respond to as they load and then fire their musket or their rifle. The column in the middle are the actual physical actions the body takes in response to the orders when they're loading and firing the rifle. And the third column is what I imagine is an internal monologue of this particular soldier, of what he might be thinking. And it's inspired by this scene in the movie Glory, where under fire and duress, this brand new soldier cannot perform the task. And I thought, maybe that soldier wasn't properly motivated. So in this particular poem, this soldier is able to complete the task. And you'll see as I read through it what his motivation was. But to set it up, imagine that this particular soldier, John Burnside, looks across the line of fire and sees his old master. So I'm going to read the first and third columns. Load. I wonder. Handle cartridge. If I look down, tear cartridge, the business end. Charge cartridge of my musket. Ram cartridge and see old master. Return rammer. Standing there. Prime if I will hesitate. Shoulder arms or remember. Ready. How many times? Aim. He beat my wife. Fire. In my mind, the proper motivation would get a different result than that particular scene in Glory produced. And that's also a way for me to kind of send a tribute to that movie Glory, because I watched it dozens of times to prepare to write these poems. And I only shared a handful of them. There's 100 pages of this work and more than 100 stories to tell. And maybe we can touch on some of them when we get to the Q&A. But if we move to the next slide, we can stop there, and maybe I can pass it to my co-host and see where we are, if it's time to move on.
Absolutely, Frank, that was remarkable. And there are so many other fantastic poems, and I just can't tell you what a pleasure it was to hear you reading them. I've been reading them to myself and Maggie behind the scenes and Kristen, but it's great to hear you reading them. Kristen and I are going to alternate asking some questions. We prepared a few, and we've got a couple from the audience. And I'll start off, and then we'll go over to Kristen. But I first off, the notes are brilliant, and the historical information at the back of the book. It's, at least like a fifth or a sixth of the book is taken up with kind of documenting what's going on and what the trigger was for this particular poem. But I understand that some of these versions of the poems were at an exhibit at the Fraser Museum of History or History Museum in Louisville. That you had a number of the documents that you showed us next to poems and what inspired them. Because I mean, it looks as though at least at least a third of these are really inspired by actual documents, as you said. But tell us about that exhibition. When was it? Will we never get a chance to see it? Or we'd love to hear what it was like going through that space.
Well, absolutely. Happy to speak about that. In fact, it really, I think the exhibit of does what I had a book would do in the beginning, and actually had all the historical documents itself. And that just was impossible to do for a book of poetry, because some of the documents themselves are so over in special collections or unreproducible. But they were able to, at the Fraser, to get facsimiles of the actual documents and a frame next to the poem. And, that for the first time, almost a year ago, I've decided to keep those poems in the permanent collection as part of the exhibit on the floor. And so you can see mention files, dates, there are census records, there are photographs, there are so many images and documents, including recruitment posters, sheet music, all the things that you can imagine that you wouldn't see in a book or in a regular exhibit. But when you put it together with the poems, I think if I in a little box next, but it really makes for a beautiful exhibit, I think. And it's, it was an honor to have the work himself on the wall next to a historical exhibit, because it's one of the I visit with my children and had been there before, but not in that capacity. And I was there recently, and we had a special in the gallery part, so it meant that we were surrounded by not just the poems and the artifacts, but there were uniforms and guns and battle flags and muskets and a cannon. I mean, it was amazing. It really created such a space and a visual power that all we needed was music for it to be a film. But it was a powerful experience.
Thank you. I'm sorry we missed it. It sounds wonderful. Kristen.
Thank you. So the Boston Public Library's programmatic theme this year is revolutionary music. Can you speak to the intersection between music and poetry and how you see them influencing each other?
Well, I don't know that I think about this separately. I really, when I think about my influences, people ask me, what were some of your earliest influences as a writer and a poet? And I always say Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and other musicians. Like for me, my first poetry was through music, was through songs. So when I teach poetry, I think about song lyrics as its own form. And I think that, it's, there are enough tricks in the bag for poets as craftsmen that they can add music, using alliteration or rhyme or different kinds of rhyme to actually, kind of force music into the words and lyrics themselves. But I think of musical lyrics as a form of poetry. I don't think of them separate.
Thank you.
A question from our audience online that we get folks love the movie Glory as well, and thank you for that. It's a favorite of mine. A question: how many Black regiments, other than the famous one from Massachusetts, as noted in the movie Glory. Can you talk about the colored troops, both in Kentucky and sort of across the Union or fighting for the Union? Do you have any numbers on that?
Well, I don't have the exact number, but there are national parks all over the country that have that information. I recommend visiting or going to the Civil War Museum in DC. They've got an amazing reenactor who's out front every day performing as a soldier, dressed in the wool, itchy blue uniform and tight shoes, sharing that kind of information and the documents. But I think one of the things about the movie Glory is people assume that that first regiment of soldiers were not ex-slaves. They were free men who volunteered, which is an important issue because it says how committed Black people were to their own freedom. And that these weren't individuals forced to go to war just to be free, that these were individuals so committed to liberation that they were willing to risk their own lives. And they did, if you know the story of Glory. But there were volunteer regiments all over the country. Louisiana, Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee. It was harder in the South. The Confederacy made it not only illegal, but punishable by death if they found an African-American in they even had it in writing that even the white soldiers who commanded those Black soldiers would be put to death immediately if they were found in uniform or found to be fighting against the Confederacy. So there are whole stories. There are so many more movie glories to be made. And many of them are like war itself, are ugly and sad and full of horror. But there's we recently rewatched the movie Harriet, which is amazing. And there's a whole middle scene that deals with Harriet's role as a Union soldier. I mean, Harriet Tubman fought for the Union. She was a Union spy. She commanded a raid that freed 750 live individuals, using a boat to come upriver. But that's a movie by itself, but you only get pieces of that, or you never get it in the historical summaries of the Civil War. And you get only a taste of it in a whole movie about Harriet Tubman's story. But there are so many stories worth making the big screen. Where's Steven Spielberg when you need him?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can you speak to your writing process and also the resources that you used for the poetry? Specifically, someone asks if you used any of the Freedmen's Bank records in your research.
Well, I think that it's important to note that I write two kinds of poetry. When I'm writing historical poetry, grounded in historical facts and history and archive material, the process begins with countless hours of research. In fact, I might spend 6 months just doing research before I write a single poem. I have 3 books about the Lewis and Clark expedition that required me to retrace the Lewis and Clark Trail all the way to the Pacific Ocean to feel like I knew enough about the experience to actually write the poems. And I think that's important if you're going to do historical poetry justice, because it's important that historical poetry honor the history, because you can't change the historical facts. Your challenge is, how can I make it more accessible by infusing it with an emotional content, the voice of a participant in such a way that you feel like your experience was almost cinematic, that you felt what happened, that you were there when it was happening, you felt some of the horror, or you felt the exhilaration of a powerful moment. That's the challenge that poets have, trying to, it's maybe unfair to say to rescue history and to make it into something cinematic, but to, I think, infuse history with this other element that you only generally experience when you're at the movies. I think we get to do that as historical poets.
Thank you.
A question we've gotten online. 20 years ago, Buffalo dance made a
Mm.
powerful impression on me. I ask, as a professional historian, how did the scarcity of sources echoing York's voice compared to your working with the hundreds of sources to produce this newest collection of poems?
Wow, thank you for that question and for acknowledging that it's been 20 years since Buffalo Dance. Um, Buffalo Dance was my first uh, kind of venture into historical poetry, and I honestly didn't know what I was doing. It took so long because I was just trying to make my way through it. But it allowed me to learn how to do this kind of work so that by the time I got to the, I guess, sixth version of this, my sixth collection of historical poetry, it was easier. I knew what to look for. Uh, I knew how much information I needed to tell a story. Uh, I knew how many more sources were available. It was significantly easier to, you know, well, I'm almost said that's unfair. It didn't require as much imagination to write the Civil War historical poems because there's so much information available. The challenge was, how to take this mountain of research material and make it something manageable, uh, kind of consume that, and then figure out which stories do I want to tell. Um, so it only made sense to me to be able to kind of compress that material even further down to a smaller, manageable amount to focus on Kentucky, since that was familiar territory for me. And I also had, family overlap, uh, and I had access to the spaces almost every day. So living in Central Kentucky, driving by Camp Nelson almost my entire life, having a chance to visit and go to programming and visit the space, it made it a lot easier to pull off. But when I did the Buffalo Dance poems and the research, my son and I spent 3 summers out west. We spent time on the Nez Perce Reservation. We retraced the Lewis Clark Trail. We drove the length of the Columbia River, uh, trying to learn what the landscape might have to say. Those kind of things are worth the research part of it. And the reward is the eventual poem that comes out of that experience where somebody feels like they were actually there because they read that poem. And that's the goal, to bring the reader closer to the event or the person, or the subject, in a way that it felt like an emotional or cinematic experience. And it wasn't just reading a historical account. Great
Wonderful.
question.
Great.
Can you tell us what you're reading now?
Wow. I'm reading mostly student papers. It's that time of the year.
Yes.
I don't get much pleasure reading in. Uh, I just reread Jacinda Townsend's Saint Monkey, which is an amazing novel set in Appalachia. Um, and I only got to read it because my students had to read it as well. And so we've been discussing it for the last 3 weeks. But most of my pleasure reading happens. I've got 2 Walter Mosley books I've been sitting on for 6 months, that I'm waiting for Christmas breaks so that I can open those pages. Um, my classes I have so many students that it's just hard to have that kind of time to read and also raise a family and teach at full schedule.
We promise to get you off of here soon for your busy night, but just one last question here. Uh, I mentioned at the end of this book these remarkable timeline of the Civil War and also your historical notes and documents. And I'm sadly unfamiliar with your other historical work. Have you always used that type of documentation at the end of your historical poetry? Is there anything different about this collection? Anything you've learned over time about educating folks through poetry about history?
Well, I think that for me, it really has, I think the subject and the time period informs the final book project. It's very different writing about something that happened in 1803 versus something that happened in 1961. My the information available about Medgar Evers from the book about Medgar Evers was very different than Buffalo Dance, where there was so little information available. So I had to travel more, and I did go to Jackson, Mississippi, to do Medgar Evers research, but I also had the advantage of at least a half dozen movies and even more books. Um, and I think the formula that requires, memory, research, and imagination, that formula shifts based on how much you remember, and how much you have to imagine when you've done all the research you can do. But the thing that's consistent is the empathy. I think the back of the book, the timelines and the historical notes have probably gotten longer for every book, because I believe I do more research because I know how to do the research. The very first time, I was finding my way through it, and it took forever. Now it feels like, because I think I've been teaching it for so long, it's almost like a science. As far as the process, it's almost scientific, but the experience, the writing process is still something that's very much about, trying to feed on the information, soak it up and kind of marry that to inspiration and empathy, and write something that feels authentic, that feels like it's coming from a cohesive voice, and hopefully says something and touches people in a way that, if they don't remember, what the words were, they remember how the poem made them feel. I count that as a win. If somebody felt something, whatever it was, if it made them sad, it made them happy, but they remember feeling something, then I did my job.
Well, mission accomplished for many of us. So thank you. You are a great success at this. And thank you for this discussion. And thank you, Kristen, too, for providing such great questions. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Frank to leave us with some last thoughts. He has read some remarkable poetry, and there's more to come in the book, but he has some other thoughts to share, which is super. So over to you for that, Frank.
Yeah, I would just say that, it may be the first time you've heard of historical poetry if you're in this audience, but there's a whole bookshelf of this amazing work out there, and I highly recommend you go find some more of it. There are books about Phyllis Wheatley, about Jack Johnson, about George Washington Carver, my own Medgar Evers and Isaac Murphy and Lewis and Clark and York books are out there, and there's even more books to be written. So those of you who love history, who also dabble in creative writing, if there's a story that you've been kind of hankering to tell, or that you're waiting for somebody else to tell, maybe you're the person that's supposed to tell it. So I encourage you to pick up some of these other books, get a sense of how we do this work, and join us and help advance, this work to the point where we can go to the library and ask, where's the historical poetry section? And they'll just point. We're not there yet, so we need you, if you got that in the back of your mind.
Kristen, a message for the BPL and for all of us. So I thank you, Frank. It's been sad and moving, but really thrilling to see history come to life through your poetry, through our reading, and through this evening. A reminder to our audience that copies of the hardcover, Load in 9 Times, can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The true brilliance of this work comes from reading poems over and again and pairing them to the historical notes in the back. It's an amazing way to experience history. As you order from Porter Square Books, input the code AMINS24, and the book will come signed by Frank on a book plate. The bookstore can send these special copies to you, to your friends or your family anywhere in the United States. Winding down our evening, first, Kristen, tell us what's happening at the Boston Public Library. What's upcoming?
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to you and the team there at American Ancestors. Thank you, Professor Frank X. Walker, and for sharing your amazing poetry with us. And thank you all in the audience for being here. Just a reminder that the Boston Public Library has resources, services, and programs for people of all ages. You can find out more at bpl.org, or if you're not in Boston or Massachusetts, check out your local public library. Thank you, Margaret. Back over to you.
We at Our American Ancestors are delighted to have presented tonight's book talk along with the BPL. If you're researching a time, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs that provide skills for family historians. You'll see on screen some of those offerings. Our mission in all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect people. And for you literary sorts, first, a special thanks to Susan Kay and John D. Thompson for their support of this series and tonight's book talk. As always, we hope you'll join us for more literary events. Next Monday, November 18, we're focusing on Midwestern and Southern history, engineering, and conservation as we hear from author Boyce Upholt about his book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. After an illustrated presentation, he'll be joined in discussion by W. Frank Eubanks, a faculty fellow at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, a writer and an essayist whose work focuses on race, identity, and the American South. On Tuesday, December 3rd, again with the Boston Public Library, Kristen and I will be back to welcome Michael Owen with his biography, Ira Gershwin, A Life in Words. He'll be joined by moderator Mark Clegg, an author and musicologist at the University of Michigan. And for our last event of the year, we'll jump overseas to talk about the great houses of Britain and their surprising connections to America and its history. Our special guest is my colleague, Kurt DiCamillo, who is an expert on these grand homes. His new work, A British Country House Alphabet, is full of insight and some whimsy, too. We hope you'll join us. Back to tonight, many thanks to our guest, Professor Frank X. Walker. It was a thrill to learn from you and to hear your poems. The three of us here, including Maggie behind the scenes, we're really grateful for your time, as is our audience. We thank everyone who tuned in, especially for your interest in American history, in learning, in understanding both the good and the bad. We hope to see you soon again. For now, a good night to all. We're gonna have your poetry in our head to this evening, Frank. Thank you so much for sharing it, and you have a good night.